So my name is Soleil Ho. I'm 32 years old, and I'm based in San Francisco, California. I'm a restaurant critic for the San Francisco Chronicle, and I I write about restaurants. I write about food, but I also have tried a little bit of writing about video games as well. And for me, food and video games are going through this really interesting parallel evolutions in cultural consciousness and in criticism, especially, where I think there are a lot of video game reviewers and critics, people like Austin Walker, Gita Jackson, who are taking the medium really seriously as cultural products, and bringing in a lot of philosophy and politics and just cultural theories. And in the food world, there's people like me and, a small number of folks who are doing similar things. So I find that parallel really, really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you, too, that, I gave you sort of a mealy-mouthed overview of sort of my journey with this stuff, and it's interesting because I've had a number of conversations with people in the food and the restaurant world, and even if they don't articulate it the way that you have, I think there is this parallel going on, and I feel, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, like if you feel like when it comes to quote-unquote mainstream or just broader consciousness, like my sense is like I feel like people who are into food are sort of grokking this change more than in games, and I don't know if that's just because like everybody eats, or if or if there's still like these weird lingering stigmas about games. Like I'm not saying these two parallel lanes are in some sort of race, but what's your sense of like which is making better inroads or which is having particular struggles, or is it pretty neck and neck?
I think that we're both struggling, both of our fields are struggling with the perception that video games and food are escapes, and that means you get to turn your brain off, and applying any sort of rigor to analysis of those products beyond, this is good, this is bad, is overreaching. I think both of our fields are going through that. That said, I think food benefits immensely from the fact that a lot of universities have more and more like food studies departments where there are like these really interesting interdisciplinary, courses and papers being written about, food and anthropology, food and sociology, food and economics, like all of that stuff, which, lends it a more kind of respectable aura, I think. And I don't see that same thing happening for video games necessarily. And so, like, if you're a writer like me, you have a lot of papers, either past or upcoming, to pull on, and a lot of academics to call on for, analysis or just, backing up or debate. Whereas I don't see that too often in the gaming world.
Yeah, I was wondering on the receiving end of all this criticism, like it's an interesting comparison. Like I'm curious if people who read about food are more savvy than people who read about games. Not that it's that necessarily compartmentalized, but I know that you possibly went through a thing with like at the Chronicle, like doing away with the star rating system, and playing games like eating is it's an inherently personal kind of experimental experience, and yet there's still this like expectation of like measuring the platonic quality of food, like this meal is a 10 out of 10. Did you experience any sort of blowback? Like I think when you wrote that thing explaining that change, I saw like some slow claps, like people were really appreciative of it, but was there any sort of resistance to that sort of seemingly small change?
I think I think for some people who are really invested in using the stars as a shortcut, or what do you call it, as a quick summary of the review, so that they didn't have to read the review, you know what I mean?
Yes.
That was an unwelcome change, because that's the headline already, is like, XYZ restaurant is a 3-star, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's the whole story, and to me, that isn't the whole story. That's not interesting, and that's also, not extremely, that doesn't make good writing. in my mind. And like, yeah, my priority is good writing and giving people something entertaining, educational, thought-provoking to read every week. So for me, the stars didn't really achieve that. And at the same time, if you want to expand your repertoire of restaurants that you write about, or video games you write about or whatever, presuming that they all exist on some linear plane against which they can be judged against each other, doesn't make any sense to me, especially because they don't all have the same starting point. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like the whole premise behind the SATs or the ACTs or whatever, where it's a standardized test and it presumes that you all start from the same place. And then it's an objective scoring based on that. But as we all know, that is not true.
Well, what about because I experienced this a lot as a critic myself in the gaming field, where there were reviews I've written in the past where, people would be sniffing and dismissing, with the line, what the hell is that? This is like a film review. I'm curious, how do people misunderstand, a restaurant critic's role, especially in the day of, Yelp, Twitter, etc.?
Yeah, that's a big question, right? Is how do we stay relevant in the face of all of this, really pseudo-democratized criticism? And,
right.
I think that it's by sticking to your ethics. That's the difference. Whereas, you read Yelp for patterns. I certainly read Yelp just to see, a general sense of, what people are talking about, but not, based on... I don't use it to... You don't trust that people on Yelp don't have their own agendas. You can't trust that they've been to a restaurant more than once. You can't trust that they're just had a bad day, and and you can't trust that they're not friends with the owner or enemies of the owner.
Right.
So it's one of those things where you just don't take it too seriously. Whereas for us, I think our strength is in claiming expertise and also claiming ethics. A restaurant critic, for example, generally will go to a restaurant 3 times before issuing judgment. And, they'll spend their own money. They won't accept free gifts. They won't ask for free gifts. And oftentimes Yelp people do that.
Yeah.
And, to me, that's what distinguishes us. Besides that, though, I think that, I don't know, that's the struggle, right? Critics in general are working at newspapers or online outlets, and you see that there's constantly layoffs and compaction, and the industry's in a lot of trouble. But at the same time, the question of how do you stay relevant is even more pressing.
Yeah, I wonder, I don't know, relevance is part of it, but I also wonder if, do you experience similar things from readers where they feel like you've crossed some imaginary line that they feel or expect, you're commenting on things that, maybe you shouldn't be? Because I feel like I see that a lot in games.
Oh, certainly. There's the stick to sports kind of line that I think a lot of us hear, but I think that boundary is an illusion, and that's the point, is that you're not, the way I see it is I'm not introducing politics or culture or, social issues or economics into food. I'm just exposing the connections that have always been there. Food is a commodity. It is a thing we buy. Right. And that very fact means it's intimately tied with the social conditions that we live in. Same with games, right? And they are products made by humans that are part of a society, part of a culture. And to describe that culture and how it infects or seeps into that product is not completely out of line at all. I think it's just people that are really, again, trying to use this as an escape and trying to kind of beat you back into the corner so that, you put those blinders on as well. I think that's a regressive viewpoint, and I don't think it's going to last for very long, because once you expose those connections, it's pretty hard not to see. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's weird because I feel in games, the sort of pushback that I see or have felt or read is sort of this I don't know if you've seen this too, it's like this sort of insecure relationship with legitimacy. And I think when you're talking about lifting some of those blinders, whether it's questing towards legitimacy or truth, I think it's ultimately, it's pushing people or encouraging people towards like a deeper understanding of the life they live and the things they fill that life with. So it always sort of struck me as odd when people were like, no, we're legitimate enough, or you shouldn't be asking these questions, or you shouldn't be writing about these things. And I don't know if it's like just simply regressive people being regressive people online, if there's some sort of fear in being complicit in other things. Obviously it's case by case, but I wonder if like you as a critic, like do you have some sort of ultimate goal, or do you feel like you're trying to build a bridge towards something with your work or with your responsibilities as a critic?
That's a good question. My ultimate goal, I guess my conspiracy and my agenda is...
Not what I'm saying. Well, yeah.
Well, for me, it's like what I want is to encourage people to have more meaningful conversations about food.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I want them to be able to... I want to give them the tools to walk into any restaurant or look at any plate and actually analyze it in a contextual way. Mm-hmm. And so, reintroducing context is basically my job. Talking about who made this food, why did they make it, how did they make it, what are all of the massive things that led to this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I think the big lie of capitalism is separating the product from the chain. It's like severing that connection and allowing us to consume without thinking about how, that consumption is meaningful and it touches so many different people and societies and, threads. It's just so connected. And to sever that connection means that you can just consume freely without any thoughts and, you keep consuming. And for me to disrupt that in some way, just with analysis, with intellect, with giving the people tools to do that, even if they didn't go to college or like read the same books or whatever, food is a really accessible way to do that because, everyone eats. Yeah. And being able to just go into like a McDonald's and make those connections, I think is really important.
Well, I'm curious too, as far, you bring up connecting threads. This is something I wanted to ask about is in your field, are there still sort of ghosts in the machine of sort of food criticism and its origins, whether it be, because I guess like what I'm thinking is like another similarity between food and games is just sort of the initial wave of critics were largely white. At least in food, it was like a lot of reviewing like prestige restaurants for prestige publications. That's a little different from like people reviewing things in Nintendo Power to sort of advocate to buy a Nintendo. But obviously there's something still in there where there's this expectation of like, I don't know, not quite service journalism, but like advocacy over, criticism. But are there ways that you still feel those origins?
I think it depends on your publication, but certainly there are a lot of really well-known critics in the past who have been critical. I don't think the pressure to be positive is universal in our industry, if that's what you mean. I think that certainly there are competing camps, and there's a lot of people who think that critics should work together with restaurateurs and, to promote a business that's really, really hard. And, people struggle on the side of like running restaurants and working at restaurants, certainly. So a bad review really sucks, and I get that.
Yeah.
At the same time, I certainly see myself more as that's interesting because you could draw this as a polarized kind of environment between restaurants and consumers. And so you can say like, I'm a consumer advocate or I'm a restaurateur advocate,
right.
But I don't really, it seems logical to say I'm a consumer advocate, but I don't think I am either. I think that I'm more of an advocate for my vision of the future, and like to to call people who don't make food consumers and just cast them as that, I think, is, again, playing into capitalistic ways of describing people that are really limiting. Certainly there are more intersections than that, and I also write for cooks and for people in the food industry, and more towards the aim, again, of like just helping people describe the world in their own words, but giving them the tools to do it. And I think that is less about, I'm trying to step outside of that binary, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you may have opinions about this being a writer as well. Like there are a couple words lately that really sort of, I don't know. Like I went in to speak at a class in Chicago yesterday, and I really was just sort of peppering. It was for a game developer class, and I was really just sort of talking to them, at least to start with, of like sort of questioning their usage of certain words and sort of encouraging them to sort of think of like, well, what do they mean when they say consumer or audience or or even industry sometimes, because for me those sort of rub me the wrong way, because they can sort of become abstractions that like prevent us from thinking about the fact that like, I don't know if you want to use the words like karmic chain, but like you were saying, like we all are sort of threaded together in the system, whether it's capitalism or something else. But that's something that always just can drive me up a wall. It's just like when I see people using words and I'm not really sure, because they're used so much, like what they even really mean anymore. I don't know if this is just a quirk of mine and I'm just a dork, or if there's stuff like that you're thinking about as well, whether it be in game criticism or food criticism or just the internet at large.
Well, I mean, certainly I am a Virgo, and most of my objections to things are semantic, so I get that.
Well, are there things that you find that like you will, like words that you never want to use, or words that, I'm not asking you to call out other writers, but like when you see these words in other people's writing, it kind of annoys you, or it bothers you?
Oh, certainly. I mean, there's so many, and when you sit down and think, oh, here's the words I actually don't want to use as a writer, the list is pretty long.
Yeah.
And not to say that these are words that I want to ban or anything. I don't have that power. I'm not the police. But, like, I really don't want to use the word badass when talking about women in general.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty farcical and just limiting. Then there's, of course, I write a lot about foods of, all kinds of cultures. And so using the words like ethnic food as a descriptor it doesn't make any sense, right? Because, like, ethnicity is like height. Like, we all have it.
Right, but it also, I don't know, it sort of ties in with like some sort of assumption of either, of some sort of neutrality or something as the default, or the status quo as the default, when it's all, I mean, who gets to say, you know what I mean?
Right, and like, what's just food then?
I mean, to bring it back to games, I mean, Are there questions or certain types? I mean, you mentioned a few critics, but I mean, are there certain questions you would like to see game reviews start asking that you feel like food and restaurant reviews have been doing better at asking?
Yeah, I mean, I think holding creators accountable for what they do is a big thing that I feel like is missing. I see a lot of critique on Twitter, certainly, of people like, Kojima, about, the choices that they make when it comes to, female characters in their games, for instance.
Yeah.
And I really want to see more of that just in general, because I think oftentimes when there's something like that in a review, it's just kind of a one-off, like, it's not really focused on that. It's more just like a review. But I think there's not enough time or, I don't know, agency given to these creators when it comes to that. It's just kind of seen as a quirk of like their personality, or it's just like their fetish is like coming through in the game. But, maybe we talk about it, maybe we critique it and like think about it in context of society and like what this what this means and why this is fine, and if it's not fine, like why it's not fine.
Yeah.
Because, games don't come in a vacuum. Like, people make them, and there are choices that happen. And I think those are all, like, pretty open to criticism.
I mean, is there a feeling in your field, like, it was interesting, just like yesterday speaking to a classroom of students. I mean, this is a class I co-created maybe 7-8 years ago, and have passed the torch, if you will, but I came back yesterday, and it was interesting to hear about their goals, and they're much more, here's that word again, they're much more audience-focused, and they're not really interested, or they don't really see a path towards furthering themselves that includes, like, they don't really see, like, quote-unquote, the websites as a governor or as a gatekeeper on their future success. I think they really just want to be featured by, like, YouTubers. And I know for a lot of critics that I know, I mean, I don't think there's ever been a, like, time where critics are, like, super rich and doing really well. But
right.
I know in games, I mean, there's a bit of a revolving door, especially because in games there's this expectation that, like, you can do it full time or you can do it exclusively. But like you mentioned Gita before, who's a friend of mine, and, like, she elected on top of her job to, and then we'll get into Pokemon from this, I guess. She elected to review that Pokemon game, and it basically just made her life hell for, like, 3 weeks, because she was just nonstop just devoting the time to playing that game on top of her normal job duties. But, I mean, really the question here is, like, is there that feeling or a similar feeling in restaurant criticism that, like, YouTubers are sort of eating your lunch? Sorry for the horrible pun. Sorry. I would have said it to anybody. I'm not trying to put it in terms you can understand. Because I think that's the expectation that I hear from a lot of other critics, is that they're sort of upset that they feel the only path forward is they need to be, like, screaming on YouTube angrily, and that there's not really a home for, thoughtful, insightful, sort of writerly criticism. And I don't know if there's that feeling in food stuff, because certainly there's, no shortage of people, like, eating food and talking about food on YouTube. Because I see those videos every time I go into YouTube being recommended for me.
Yeah, I mean, all I can say is that when the media, like, big M media, proposed, pivoting to video, it did not end well.
I've heard.
So I'm wary of that, and I think, like, any kind of attempt to bridge that gap, or transfer the writerly journalistic kind of stuff to video is not going to be elegant. It's not going to be pretty either, because the executives don't know what they're doing. So there's this. I don't think there's any chance of it, and I think everyone can have their own lane. And that's the great part about the internet. You can have a niche where you just eat squid on video for an hour, and, like, that's great. And in the same way, like, I don't see myself as needing to be everything and all things in criticism. I have my own lane in the newspaper, and if people don't read it, that's fine.
Yeah.
People read it and don't watch YouTube videos, that's fine too. And I don't think we're not competing for the same people, and people are also very expansive with their time, and there are so many contexts in which, we all consume, like, so much all the time. It's not something I worry about.
Is there a similar, like I mentioned, Gita and Pokemon? I mean, I was telling that class yesterday a bit about this, how in games, critics are really averse to, just because, like, from a time proposition and an opportunity cost, like, if you're freelancing and writing reviews, you'd rather avoid, like, a role-playing game, because you don't want to spend 80 hours playing a game that then you're going to probably be writing a review of for 5 or 6 hours over 2 or 3 days. It just doesn't make sense, to get your $150 or something like that. Is there a similar sort of genre or cuisine, or is there a similar aversion in food criticism that, like, you notice, like, people don't write about X type of restaurant or food because of Y reason, or is there no real parallel there?
I think that there's not a huge parallel in that way. I mean, there's certainly hours, like if I need to go up into wine country and go to a tasting menu restaurant, that's like a 7-hour proposition for the day, and I have to go 3 times. So that's about 21 hours of my life devoted to one restaurant review, and that's not even just the writing part. So, like, I get that. It's not as dire as an RPG, certainly. But, there's all kinds of other stuff that you have to do.
Yeah.
So, I mean, luckily with, like, eating, there's only so much you can consume in one sitting. So there's a natural kind of, like, biological stopgap there.
That's true. The stomach will give out sooner than the eyes and the back, I suppose, and the wrists, I guess. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, like, you have to sleep, and, you can't, it's not like you can eat while, you can eat at a restaurant at home or in bed or on the toilet or whatever.
The toilet, yeah. Well, you can
game. I mean, some people do, probably.
You can game on the toilet as well.
Yeah.
So you had brought up this thing about Pokemon, which, I don't know, you mentioned, I don't know, so this is sort of like a thread I'm trying to figure out how to talk about here, but you had mentioned like this sort of relationship you've noticed between developers, consumers, capitalism, and the language of ownership, and you talked about this negative chatter about the new Pokemon, sort of, you said it was arguing about things that you, quote, don't care a whit about. For people who are reading or listening, like, so what was this, what I mean, I know about it, but for people who don't know about it, like, what were these arguments about, and what did you notice, and where did you notice them, and what sort of patterns did you notice about them?
Oh, what's funny is that I guess it's kind of a meme now, but even this morning, I was just on Twitter because I, do that to myself. Yep. And there was, I think the official Pokemon account, I don't think I follow it, but like they posted, a picture of Team Rocket from the anime, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's cute. And I clicked on it, and then like it was just tons of comments about the national Dex. And like bringing back like all of the Pokemon from game 1 to the present to the new Pokemon game, and I was just like, who cares? Who the fuck cares? I don't care. But people like have taken on this level of obsession where they're just flooding the internet with this sentiment that like I don't understand. And it doesn't mean that it's not valid because I don't understand, but like it's just I guess I don't understand like why this is the thing that you care about.
I mean, it seems like, and that's
right now there's shit going on.
I mean, that's the thing I've tracked over the last few years, and honestly, it's hard to think or talk about them without sighing, like, because I just always wonder, like, well, what's driving these eruptions of negativity? Like, what's really going on? Because I think it's tempting to be like, oh, well, that's just gamers for you. But I always just find it so interesting that, like, one person reaches this conclusion that they're, like, outraged about that thing. But then why do so many people not only reach that same conclusion, but then they're like, I have to take to the internet and just sort of, I don't know. Like, I've gotten dinged in the past over my use of the word entitlement, because I think that applies in these kinds of situations. I just still don't understand, like, what's driving this, I don't think it's just a video game thing, but it often, manifests in that space.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing when you think about what we talked about earlier about the binary between creators or, entrepreneurs or businesses and consumers. This is a form of like consumers talking back and demanding things of the product.
Right.
And it's like a fandom thing, right? Like you saw this with Star Wars too, when it was getting more diverse and people were really, they had petitions, or like Game of Thrones, where there's a petition to like rewrite the last season. There's this interesting thing in like nerd fandom that I'm seeing where I don't see this in restaurants really. Like no one's demanding that, the French Laundry include more grilled cheese sandwiches. Like that's just not a thing.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, if there's similar patterns in your neck of the woods. Because I feel like I haven't heard that, but I'm always in favor of more grilled cheeses.
I mean, the only things I see are like on the sort of, or related to like social justice issues, right? Where like, or maybe like a restaurant owned by someone who is convicted of sexual assault, like is being protested against or like boycotted. Like that is what I see in the restaurant world. But when it comes to like fandom type stuff, like Pokemon or whatever, it does seem, I think entitlement is a good word for it, but at the same time, I don't have much pity for like corporations either. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't really get the whole thing, because you want to see your desires reflected in this medium, and you feel strongly that like this will solve some sort of problem for you. And I've never felt that much ownership over something. I've never felt reflected in media, like 100% anyway. So I never got invested in that way. I could never even dream of it. So it's kind of funny to think like, oh wow, like if there's like a, you know, Squirtle in the new game, like that's all you need, huh? That's cute.
I mean, I'm thinking about it. Like a friend of mine who lives out your way and works in Silicon Valley, like she and I don't know, she came up with this sort of mantra or explanation of these things that I think about a lot, because I think a lot of people who get upset about things like, in this case, like a very arbitrary consumerist thing of like, I want every Pokemon ever, which is a demand of sorts, sure. I get it. But like, it feels like a lot of people who do that sort of stuff are also like, they believe in like some sort of conspiracy theories that sort of like rule the industry or rule the reason that things become the way they are. And my friend had this thing where she's like, you know, people who tend to lean on conspiracy theories or get swept up in these little eruptions, like they typically are people who don't take responsibility for themselves in their own lives in general. And I don't want to generalize about it, but I mean, I don't know. I feel like, especially like everything else that's going on nowadays, it's just like, really, this is the thing that this is the thing that's setting you into a tailspin.
Yeah, I mean,
and I don't want to seem like I'm making fun of them, but it's just like it's so dissonant. I mean, it was even strange, 5-10 years ago, but nowadays it's like, aren't you exhausted of being angry about this thing all the time? This thing of all things?
Yeah, I mean, there's a level of sentimentality to this that I find really interesting, because it is the logical endpoint of the corporate, like, intellectual property thing. You know what I mean? Like, they have nurtured this as creators, in a sense, right? Like with the Avengers, with, like, comics, with movies and games, they nurture a sense of family, of sentimentality, and this is part of what they reap. Because then now you have people who feel like they have a say in it. They're equal partners, when, to contradict that is to actually tell the truth and say that, like, actually we're beholden to our shareholders, not you. Actually the construct of capitalism means that you have actually little power beyond buying this or not buying this, and you've already bought this, so boo.
I think sometimes that's what's driving that kind of rage is, people get invested early on, maybe like at the first mention of a game or a preview, and then they basically are doing a lot of guerrilla marketing or being the street team for it and advocating for it, and they get swept up in it, and then in the end they realize like their opinion doesn't really matter that much. Like, they bought a game, and like, they're entitled to like a product that works, that they can play from start to finish. But other than that, like, I mean, I can't think of a parallel of this in the restaurant world, where it would be like, or like you go to like like you get really angry about this new deli that opens, and like you see the site, you see the construction site, or maybe like you read about it on Eater or like some local, next door or one of those things, or like you see a posting of like, oh, they have a business license up on the window, and you're really excited because there hasn't been a deli in your city or in your town or in your neighborhood or whatever, and it's like then it opens and you go there, and it's like you're outraged that like it's not a Korean restaurant, and like.
Or just outraged that they don't have your favorite sandwich, and
even in that more plausible thing, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is really right. Where it's so close to like a macro critique of capitalistic structures. Yeah. Like they've got egg on their face. They've been played, so you don't, but they pivot to demanding more from that same like company. Whereas like actually you could have they make it so that like if they get the Squirtle they're appeased, but like really it's not about that.
Yeah, give me Squirtle or give me death, I suppose.
Yeah, there's a third way. It's not Squirtle or death.
I don't know. I mean, because like I know from people who work in games, like the way that some of them have talked to me about this is what they find interesting is just sort of the reaction from people. Like they've never been disappointed in their lives before or something. Anyway, we don't need to go all down that rabbit hole because I wanted to make sure to ask you sort of what inspired this essay that you wrote, Ms. Pac-Man's Revenge. And I don't know how long ago you wrote it, and I read it in the fall, and I don't know how ancient history or how interested you are to sort of dig it back up. But I would just be curious to hear you talk a little about, like, A, what it is for folks who haven't read it, but also, what sort of inspired it in you.
Yeah, sure. So this essay is in an anthology called Women on Food, and I was asked by the editor of the anthology, Charlotte Druckman, if I wanted to write something, just anything for it, and she encouraged me to write about something that I haven't had the space for, or like no publication would take, or right. The kind of article or essay that people at legacy publications would naturally not be interested in. So, of course, I wanted to write about video games. Because I can't think of anyone really who would publish a piece that is about both of those things, video games and food. That was hard to even think of. So I wanted to write about how there's a really interesting intersection between the appearance of food in video games and like gender, and just how, and like participatory kind of dynamics in video games. So I start with talking about Pac-Man and about how that was a game geared explicitly towards women, and so that's why the theme was food.
Yeah.
And then I talk about kind of the sidelining of food in games, like with games like Streets of Rage or Castlevania, where food would just kind of appear out of like holes and garbage cans to refill your health bar. It was really functional. Yeah.
Right.
And then I just kind of go through the increasing relevance of food as something that's like a mini game or like sort of luxuriated in a game, like in Final Fantasy 15, for instance. Or was it 15 or 13? God, I don't remember anymore. I think it was 15. Yeah, 13 is a different one.
I don't know.
It's Final Fantasy 15 where like you get to cook while you're on a road trip with your bros.
Oh, right.
And there's all kinds of recipes you can collect. Breath of the Wild, of course, where cooking's a huge like kind of mini game there, and like the new Pokemon, where that didn't come out by the time I'd written the essay, but like certainly it's another case where the curry dex allows you to cook like 100 different curries, and that's part of the game too. And you can opt into it; it's not mandatory, but
right.
They give you the option to just play around with it and have fun with it, and I think that's really cool. So yeah, I just talk about how how food gives people a really different entree into the medium, and yeah, I guess that's what the essay is about. Really, it's kind of sprawly, it could have easily just been a list of my favorite foods from games, starting with Harvest Moon. But, there's a little more sense.
No, it was great. I mean, I understand why it would be difficult to find a home for that stuff. And for people like me, it's like, where do you even go to read stuff like that? So it was really cool to happen upon. I think I read about it in Eater or something. Like, I don't think I saw any game places pick it up. But, like, I mean, I think I would just be interested to hear you talk a little bit about, like, what you feel are, like, obstacles, like, formal or structural to, like just, like, what resistances are there to the presence of food being more in games? Like, you mentioned gender as one, but I wonder if there are others that you've noticed, or... I mean, I don't even know if for people hearing about this, I don't know if they're like, well, why do I care if there's food in games? But I mean, I think that's sort of one of the bigger things that games are struggling with is like, are they merely an escape? Are they merely a diversion? Are they meant to reflect real life? I mean, what resistances do you feel there are to like this not being more of a thing?
Well, I mean, I think that, certainly video games aren't taken seriously by, like, mainstream media. I think the Washington Post has a games reporter, which is awesome.
Yeah.
But the rest of the papers, I can't really name any other ones that do that. Maybe there are. So
they're not
I think
they're not really interested in this sort of stuff. I mean, there's sort of like a perfect storm of media cutbacks, and then our political landscape, and I think it was really hard to make the case for this sort of stuff, as I've been trying, 5-6 years ago, which is part of why I started doing this project, and I think it's even harder to make that case now. So. Anyway, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just agreeing with you because that's been sort of my fight, and now I'm like, okay, I don't know what we do then. I guess we just keep. I think it's stuff like like the essay you wrote, or maybe in some way the sort of work where it's like, all right, I'll just do this on my own. I don't really know what the solution is, and I don't really know enough about game development. I mean, it seems kind of straightforward, right? Like just put food in games.
Right. I mean. One of the things I can say about this in particular is that, like, working in the newsroom with a bunch of other writers and journalists enables a lot more collaboration. And so it's easy to do, like, food business stories, food tech stories. Their desks are right near ours. Whereas there's not a lot of, like, intersection between our worlds and food writing and games writing. We don't interact in a meaningful way. And so the potentials for collaboration, like, someone would have to just, like, reach out on Twitter or in a DM, but, like, where would we publish it,
Yeah.
And I would think, like, at the Washington Post, like, if the games reporter wanted to talk to the food people about something, they could just walk right over and maybe have a conversation about it, So I think that dynamic is really important as to why. And I think that, there's the fact that there's no publication for it is a huge deal, and I could see, like, zines certainly, but not like full-fledged, like, newspapers or magazines or like online publications, which is sad and disappointing.
Right.
But I think more and more now, as food becomes, like, a fixation for people, right? Like, it's all over Instagram, it's all over everything, and, like, gamers clearly resonate with, like, food content in games, as we can all see through the success of all of those mechanics. I think it's going to get more and more interesting, for sure, and richer, I think, because developers see that, and they certainly want to, like, cash in on that.
Right. Yeah. When in doubt, count on the money-making aspect of it being enticing for these sorts of frontiers of inclusion, or just trying to take risks. I think that's a correct impulse. I mean, do you have a sense though of like what more food in games might look like? Like, what are things that we are sort of, or games are sort of actively like either shunning or like keeping at the door that you think would be really interesting or resonant themes? Because like I think about it, like there are really great, awesome, movies about food, like Tampopo or The Big Night, if that's the one with Tony Shalhoub that I'm thinking of. But like when I think about
Yeah.
like, really great games that like revolve more directly about food, like I can think of like Cooking Mama, which I don't think is necessarily the sort of thing that you and I have been talking about the shape of, but not directly naming. And I feel like in many ways, like I used to do like restaurant capsules and things when I was at the Onion forever ago, and I always felt that like food writing it is even harder than writing about games because you're writing about such an intangible, personal thing. So I feel like you've given this a lot more thought than I have because you've had to because you do it professionally.
Yeah, no, I totally see what you're trying to say here.
Emphasis on trying.
But I think the future of it would be centered in like actually using food as something playful and not just functional. Because I think the best part about cooking for me is having a bunch of random things and just think, what can I do with this? Game terms. Like, what do you do with all this food? Because for so many, I think the majority of games that involve food, you're like kind of running on a track. There are set recipes in the game, and you just like press a button and you make it. Or like you can't. For example, in Breath of the Wild, like if you add a recipe, like you'll just come out with some garbage. There's a little bit of experimentation, which is fun, but like it's like on a track. So for me, what's interesting is a game like Noor. Have you heard of that one?
How do you spell it?
Nour.
I don't think so. No.
It's a game in development by this independent developer named TJ Hughes, and it is so funny.
A physics-based ramen game. I'm game.
Yeah, and it actually allows you to like play with food in a basic way. I think so many games that include food, you're not actually playing with the food; you're just making it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like TJ's game is really funny because you can really you can make like infinite pancakes, and you just make food appear. Like the making of it is elided in favor of just like making burgers collide on screen. I think that's really, really cool.
Just making me think of like all those commercials for like orange juice or things where like you just see the waterfall of orange juice and like fruits smashing against each other under it. Maybe I have like one or two more questions here for you. I know we kind of slalomed around a bit. Was there something that you wanted to mention or bring up that maybe you thought and I didn't give you an opportunity to explore?
No, I think we went into it.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Harvest Moon and you wrote about Harvest Moon, and I think this is sort of maybe the other end of talking about trying to represent food better. Do you feel like is there a way that like farming games like Harvest Moon can connect us even in small ways to organic food production? Or like, I don't know, like are there ways that just like having food in a game isn't just like some sort of functional thing, like it can actually make you think about the world in some way?
Yeah, I think, Harvest Moon is a very romanticized vision of like what farming is like.
Right.
A turnip is not worth $150. That's ridiculous. So, it's at the same time, it is really good. Like, it got me interested in food production when I was a kid.
Yeah.
So beyond that, not really, but if you're a city kid who has no idea like where broccoli comes from, it could be a really helpful thing to play and see. So, I get that part. I think that for me was the most helpful, most interesting. And, of course it has its flaws, but I think as far as like making that basic connection of like, oh, you grow vegetables or you should be nice to cows if you're going to use them for milk, like that kind of thing, I think at a basic level is really helpful.
Yeah. All right. Well, this will be my last question for you, and this is just sort of something I ask everybody, and it's super abstract and just always interesting to hear discussed or weighed in on. What do you think video games have accomplished?
That's a good question. It's such a broad category of thing too, but I guess for me, what is great is that, like any literature or any cultural product, the ease at which they transport us into other ways of thinking and other ways of existing, I think is really, really great. To some, of course, that's limited. It doesn't breed ultimate empathy by any means, but at least allowing us to imagine, at their best, it allows us to imagine other ways of existing. I think that's the best part about them.